The Detroit Red Wings were the best team that missed the playoffs last season, finishing with 91 points, just one shy of making the playoffs as the second Eastern wildcard team. They held a playoff position for most of the season, but struggled in the final month, ultimately missing out on the postseason on the last day of the regular season. This would mark the 8th straight season where the Red Wings would fail to qualify for the Stanley Cup playoffs, the second longest streak in the NHL. And this feeling of failure, this feeling of missing the playoffs is unfamiliar for Red Wings fans because before their current playoff drought, they had made the playoffs for 25 straight years, winning 4 Stanley Cups and dominating the NHL. So these 8 years without the playoffs, it isn't just a drought. It's a cultural shock for a fan base that grew accustomed to parades and success through Detroit for a quarter of a century. And the shift from a perennial contender to now a rebuilder has left many fans wondering when it'll end. The rebuild was inevitable for Detroit. To keep a team competitive for 25 straight years is a very hard level of success to maintain, so when the Wings were eliminated from the 2016 playoffs, the fans and management both knew that this was likely the beginning of the end. The first brick to fall was the longtime Detroit superstar Pavel Datsyuk, who was foregoing the last year of his contract to go back to play in Russia. He was a main component of that offense, so Detroit knew they had some work to do, and they got busy over the offseason. And they started by changing out a lot of their coaching staff. They hired Doug Huda as the new defensive assistant coach, and they also got a new goaltending coach and an offensive associate coach. And along with who was changing behind the bench, they also made a lot of trades and signings to try and keep this team competitive. They brought back guys like Riley Sheahan, Darren Helm, Danny DeKeyser, Peter Mrazek, and Luke Glendening, while also signing free agents like Franz Nielsen, Thomas Vanek, and Steve Ott. Heading into the new season, their roster was a far cry from what it had been, but they hoped to stay at least somewhat competitive and try and sneak into the playoffs. Well, they failed to do that. In their last season at the famous Joe Louis Arena, their Wings posted a losing record, finishing second to last in the Atlantic Division and missed out on the playoffs for the first time since the 1990 season. Throughout the season, they shipped out a pretty important piece of their forward core in Thomas Vanek to try and make room for the impending youth movement. Over the offseason, they continued to trade players for future assets. They got rid of Sheahan, Tatar, Mrazek, and they headed into the 2017-2018 season very depleted. And that showed. They finished 5th in the Atlantic Division and missed out on the playoffs. And this season truly set the idea that the Wings were now a rebuilding team. They no longer had the team that they did 5 years ago. They were aging, getting worse, and it would only make sense for them to commit to the rebuild rather than trying to hold on to every last piece and destroy your future. They landed the 6th overall pick in the draft and also had 3 picks inside the top 40. Unfortunately, at 6th, they got Filip Zadina, a guy who's never really panned out. At 30th, they got Joe Veleno, another guy who also didn't pan out. At 33rd, they landed Jonathan Berggren, who also hasn't really panned out. And at 36th, they took Jared McIsaac, who, shocker, did not pan out. And this 2018 draft really just stands as a cautionary tale for rebuilds. Missing on multiple picks in the early rounds doesn't just slow progress, it resets the entire timeline. For Detroit, it was a major step backward at a time when momentum was desperately needed. So 0 for 4 in the first 2 rounds, and the offseason didn't really get much better. In September, just before the next season started, their long-term captain, Henrik Zetterberg, retired due to a back injury. Zetterberg's departure also symbolized the official end of an era. For fans, seeing the team fail to replace iconic players like Datsyuk and Zetterberg has only deepened their frustration. The emotional toll of watching these legends just leave the team without a clear successor is immeasurable. But with Zetterberg off the team, although it was under sad circumstances, it did open up the roster a bit for younger talent to come in. Dylan Larkin had a breakout year with 73 points, Andreas Athanasiou looked pretty solid, Tyler Bertuzzi put up his first 20-goal season of his career, and defensive Filip Hronek, who they drafted back in 2016, was looking pretty good in his rookie season. Mid-season, they did trade Gustav Nyquist to the Sharks, which further opened up the roster, but also made it a lot weaker in terms of firepower. But that's what you're going to get when teams are fully committed to a rebuild. You sell players high and hopefully get a good return that will help in the long run. And just 5 days after the regular season ended, and the Red Wings of course missed the playoffs, they fired GM Ken Holland and hired Red Wings legend Steve Yzerman as the new general manager of the club, a man who led the city to championships as a player, and now he's going to try and come in to replicate it as a GM. In Tampa Bay, Stevie Y built one of the best teams of the salary cap era, not just by landing top draft picks, but through smart mid-round selections, undrafted signings, and trades that turned average assets into great assets. And that's an area that the Red Wings were definitely struggling in, with several draft picks failing to pan out, i.e. the 2018 draft. But this would be a new challenge for Yzerman. He came into Tampa and he had an amazing forward talent, he had a great #1 D-man. So yes, he did a good job in Tampa, but he really doesn't have those assets in Detroit. So moving forward, it was going to be a very big test for Stevie Y. And his tenure couldn't really have started any worse. His first big move was on draft day, where he selected Moritz Seider at 6th overall. Sure, he's a good player now, but at the time this shocked just about everyone on the draft floor.
Moritz Seider. You can hear the reaction here in this arena.
Then, after that shocker of a pick, Yzerman followed it up by managing the Red Wings to last place in the entire NHL, putting up just 17 wins and getting outscored by 122 goals. It was the lowest points percentage since the 1999-2000 Atlanta Thrashers. Detroit's struggles couldn't have been more obvious. Their penalty kill was the worst in the league, and their power play wasn't much better. And they were averaging the fewest shots in the league while giving up the 5th most. By just about every single measure, they were one of the worst NHL teams in the past 20 years. But maybe that was by design. When Yzerman took over in the offseason, the biggest move he made was signing aging center Valtteri Filppula. Once the season started, they left out most of their top prospects and put them in the AHL, including Moritz Seider, Filip Zadina, and Joe Veleno, and they even sent down Michael Rasmussen, who had already played with the big team. The Wings relied on their top line of Tyler Bertuzzi, Dylan Larkin, and Anthony Mantha to carry the load, but the rest of the roster was weighed down by bad contracts left over from the Ken Holland era. Guys like Darren Helm, Franz Nielsen, and Justin Abdelkader were eating up over $13 million in cap space and only managed to score 13 goals between all of them. For fans, this season felt like rock bottom. Watching the team post one of the worst goal differentials in modern NHL history was a stark reminder of just how far the mighty had fallen. The awful season unfortunately didn't even land them the 1st overall pick. Instead, they selected Lucas Raymond at 4th overall. The 2020-2021 season showed some signs of progress for the Wings, even though they were still far from competitive. They managed 19 wins this season, cut their goal differential down to just -43, their penalty kill jumped from dead last to just 22nd, and the team tightened up defensively, allowing 43 fewer goals. But the offense, it was still a mess. They ranked 30th in goals scored, and the power play remained one of the league's worst. Yzerman's offseason moves were all about clearing bad contracts and adding some affordable depth guys. Veterans like Mark Stahl and Bobby Ryan brought leadership, while younger guys like Filip Zadina and Michael Rasmussen started stepping into bigger roles. The Wings, however, weren't anywhere close to playoff contention. But the improved defense and development of prospects gave fans some hope for the future. That year's draft was another big step forward in the Yzer plan. With the 6th overall pick, they grabbed Swedish defenseman Simon Edvinsson, a towering blue liner with great skating ability and a high upside. It was clear Detroit was focused on building a strong foundation on the back end. Later in that first round, they traded up to select goaltender Sebastian Cossa at 15th overall, addressing their need for a future franchise goalie. The next season felt like a turning point for the Red Wings, with some exciting progress finally showing. Rookies Moritz Seider and Lucas Raymond stole the show. Seider stepped up right into a top defensive role and ended up winning the Calder Trophy, while Raymond brought a spark to the offense and quickly became a fan favorite. The team had its ups and downs, finishing with 32 wins and a -82 goal differential. Goaltending was a pretty big weak spot, with Alex Nedeljkovic and Thomas Greiss both struggling for consistency, and the defense left them exposed more often than not. On the offensive side, Dylan Larkin had a great bounce-back season, and Tyler Bertuzzi hit career highs, but scoring depth was still an issue all throughout the roster. Even with all the inconsistencies, this season still felt like real progress. With Seider and Raymond starting to look like future stars, and Dylan Larkin and Tyler Bertuzzi hitting their primes, expectations were rising. Fans were eager to see if this team could take another step forward, especially after Yzerman's offseason moves to bolster the roster with players like Andrew Kopp, David Perron, and Ben Sherratt. The hope was that with the mix of veteran additions and young talent, they would finally be able to push Detroit closer to a playoff spot and show that the rebuild was nearing its payoff. But the 2023 season showed differently. It was a mixed bag for the Red Wings. They made some improvements, but inconsistency was still a big issue. The new additions helped steady the roster. David Perron brought a much-needed scoring boost, and Ben Shaw added some grit to the blue line. Dylan Larkin had a fantastic season, solidifying his role as the team's leader, while Moritz Seider and Lucas Raymond kept developing, even if they did hit a few sophomore slumps along the way. Goaltending, as always, was rocky, with Ville Husso showing some flashes of brilliance, but other times struggling to stay consistent under all the workload. In the end, Detroit fell short of the playoffs again. Still, there was no denying the progress they made. With a stronger foundation in place, fans were left hopeful that the growing mix of veterans and young stars could finally get the Red Wings back into playoff contention next season. Yzerman made some real smart moves in the offseason, bringing in Alex DeBrincat and JT Compher to add some much-needed firepower to the offense. DeBrincat's arrival felt like a turning point for the rebuild, a signal that Detroit was ready to invest in proven talent to complement their young core. And this idea was brought further when Yzerman went out and signed Patrick Kane in the middle of November. He made some bold moves, but also moves that came with pressure to deliver immediate results. And they paid off. This team was looking more consistent than ever. DeBrincat and Compher made an immediate impact, Dylan Larkin continued to lead by example, and young stars like Seider and Raymond took their games to the next level, giving the roster even more depth. Even with the progress, Detroit had a tough time in a stacked Atlantic Division and came up short of a playoff spot yet again. But even missing the playoffs, the progress was hard to ignore, and fans were left with a renewed sense of optimism for the future and in Steve Yzerman. And speaking of Steve Yzerman, he had a busy offseason, making some big moves yet again to try and push this team forward. They added Vladimir Tarasenko, who was fresh off a cup win with Florida, and re-signed Patrick Kane for another year after his impressive half-season with Detroit. The team also secured its future by signing Lucas Raymond to a massive 8-year deal and extending Moritz Seider with a 7-year contract. To round things out, they brought in veteran goaltender Cam Talbot to boost their depth in net. It was clear that the Wings were serious about ending their playoff drought, and fans were wondering when this would all work out. Despite all these efforts, the Red Wings still face challenges here in the 2024-2025 season. As of recording, they are in the middle of the Atlantic Division, boasting around a .500 record. The Yzer plan has been a big rallying cry for some fans, but for others it's starting to feel more like an excuse. 8 years into this rebuild, with no playoffs in sight, people are running out of patience. Is this just what it takes to build the right way, or have there been missteps along the way? Despite the uncertainty, the Wings still have an exciting future ahead. Thanks to a mix of young talent and smart development, by 2027, players like Moritz Seider and Lucas Raymond are expected to be leading the charge, with Raymond hitting his stride as a top scorer and a key player on the power play. Prospects like Nate Danielson and Marco Kasper bring a lot of promise too, adding skill and grit into the lineup. On defense, Seider teaming up with Simon Edvinsson could create a powerhouse pairing that's tough to beat. In goal, Sebastian Cossa and Trey Augustine look like a solid duo with different styles that complement each other well, and while the team could use another star forward and maybe some added depth on defense, they're definitely trending towards being a playoff team with the potential to surprise a lot of people. The Yzer plan has been a roller coaster. On one hand, he's brought in a bunch of young studs and made some solid trades and draft moves, but let's be real, 8 straight years of missing the playoffs has fans wondering, is this actually working? For a team that used to dominate the NHL with 25 straight playoff runs and 4 Stanley Cups, this drought hits hard. The pieces are falling into place, but the Red Wings need to prove that the never-ending rebuild is just that, it's a rebuild, not a permanent state of mediocrity. The time to take off is now.